Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 4 of our complete practice question series for the SAA-C03, AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate Exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 4. Question number 108. A regulated company must back up Amazon EC2 resources and several Amazon S3 buckets. Recovery points must remain unchanged and undeletable until their required retention periods expire. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Use Amazon Data Lifecycle Manager to create automated EBS snapshot policies and separate S3 lifecycle rules. Option B. Use AWS Backup to create a backup vault, configure Vault Lock in compliance mode, and assign the required backup plan. Option C. Use Amazon S3 File Gateway for the backups and manage retention with S3 lifecycle transitions. Option D. Use AWS Backup with Vault Lock in governance mode and create the required backup plan. The correct answer is B. Use AWS Backup to create a backup vault, configure Vault Lock in compliance mode, and assign the required backup plan. Here's why. AWS Backup can centrally protect supported EC2 and S3 resources. Vault Lock compliance mode makes the retention controls immutable after the grace period, preventing deletion or shortening before expiration. Why are the other options not correct? A. Data Lifecycle Manager does not centrally protect both EC2 and S3 with immutable vault retention. C. S3 File Gateway and Lifecycle rules do not provide the required backup vault immutability. D. Governance mode can be changed or bypassed by principals with sufficient permissions. Exam tip. Use AWS Backup Vault Lock compliance mode when retained backups must be immutable even to administrators. Question number 109. A publishing platform runs a content management system on one Amazon EC2 instance. Website images are stored on an attached EBS volume, and the database is already highly available in Amazon Aurora. The company wants shared file access, resilient web capacity, and faster global delivery. Which two changes should be made? Choose 2. Option A. Move the images to an S3 bucket and mount the bucket as a general POSIX file system on every CMS instance. Option B. Create an AMI, run at least 2 instances across 2 availability zones behind an application load balancer, and place a AWS Global Accelerator in front of the website. Option C. Move the images to an Amazon EFS file system and mount the file system on every CMS instance. Option D. Export an NFS share from the original EC2 instance and mount that share on all additional instances. E. Create an AMI, run at least 2 instances across 2 availability zones in an auto-scaling group behind an application load balancer, and add an Amazon CloudFront distribution. The correct answer is C. Move the images to an Amazon EFS file system and mount the file system on every CMS instance. E. Create an AMI, run at least 2 instances across 2 availability zones in an auto-scaling group behind an application load balancer, and add an Amazon CloudFront distribution. Here's why. EFS supplies shared regional file storage to all CMS instances. A multi-availability zone auto-scaling group and ALB remove the single web server failure point, while CloudFront caches web content near users. Why are the other options not correct? A. An S3 bucket mount is not a general drop-in POSIX file system for this CMS workload. B. Global Accelerator improves network routing, but does not cache static website images like CloudFront. D. Serving NFS from the original instance retains a storage single point of failure. Exam tip. For resilient CMS workloads, combine shared multi-availability zone file storage, horizontally scaled web servers, and edge caching. Question number 110. A payment platform produces a continuous stream of transaction events. The company must perform stateful analysis in near real time and then deliver the processed records to an Amazon S3 data lake with minimal infrastructure management. Which architecture is the most operationally efficient? Option A. Use AWS Glue batch jobs to ingest the events and use Amazon Managed Service for Apache Flink to analyze the batch output. Option B. Ingest events with Amazon Kinesis data streams. Analyze them with Amazon Managed Service for Apache Flink and send the results through Amazon Data Firehose to Amazon S3. Option C. Send each event through Amazon API Gateway. Analyze it with AWS Lambda and build custom buffering and S3 delivery logic. Option D. Use Amazon Kinesis data streams and AWS Lambda for analysis without configuring a managed delivery path to Amazon S3. The correct answer is B. Ingest events with Amazon Kinesis data streams. Analyze them with Amazon Managed Service for Apache Flink and send the results through Amazon Data Firehose to Amazon S3. Here's why. Kinesis data streams provides a managed streaming source. Managed Service for Apache Flink performs stateful real-time analysis, and Data Firehose delivers the process stream to S3 with managed buffering and retries. Why are the other options not correct? A. Glue batch processing does not provide the required continuous near real-time ingestion pattern. C. API gateway and custom Lambda delivery logic add buffering, scaling, retry, and delivery administration. D. The option omits a managed delivery mechanism for reliably loading the processed results into S3. Exam tip. For managed real-time analytics, use Kinesis data streams, Managed Service for Apache Flink, and Data Firehose delivery. Question number 111. An education portal serves large amounts of static course material from Amazon Linux EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group behind an application load balancer. Static downloads cause the group to launch additional on-demand instances. The company wants to lower cost without reducing availability. What is the most cost-effective redesign? Option A. Replace all on-demand instances with spot instances while continuing to serve static files from EC2. Option B. Purchase reserved instances for the auto-scaling group and keep the existing content architecture. Option C. Place the static objects behind API gateway and use Lambda functions to return each file. Option D. Store the static assets in Amazon S3 and distribute them through Amazon CloudFront. The correct answer is D. Store the static assets in Amazon S3 and distribute them through Amazon CloudFront. Here's why. S3 and CloudFront offload static requests from the EC2 fleet. Edge caching reduces origin traffic and prevents unnecessary scaling of application servers. Why are the other options not correct? A. Spot instances can be interrupted and do not correct the inefficient static content design. B. Reserve pricing can reduce baseline cost, but still uses EC2 capacity for object delivery. C. API gateway and Lambda add unnecessary cost and complexity for static files. Exam tip. Move static assets to S3 and CloudFront before adding compute capacity to serve them. Question number 112. A global design application lets users upload and download unique files that can be several gigabytes each. The files are stored in AWS. Access is geographically distributed, and the company needs a cost-effective way to reduce long-distance transfer latency for both uploads and downloads. Which solution should be used? Option A. Run EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group and use Amazon Elastic Cache to store the uploaded files. Option B. Run EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group and place Amazon CloudFront in front of the upload and download service. Option C. Store the files in Amazon S3 and enable S3 transfer acceleration. Option D. Store the files in Amazon S3 and rely only on cache control headers. The correct answer is C. Store the files in Amazon S3 and enable S3 transfer acceleration. Here's why. S3 scales for large unique objects, and transfer acceleration uses nearby edge locations and the AWS global network to improve long-distance uploads and downloads. Why are the other options not correct? A. Elastic Cache is an in-memory cache and is not appropriate for durable gigabyte-scale user files. B. CloudFront can optimize downloads, but is not the direct solution for accelerating the required large uploads. D. Cache control helps repeated downloads, but does not accelerate unique uploads. Exam tip. Use S3 transfer acceleration for global, long-distance transfers of large objects. Question number 113. A small business runs two manually launched web servers in one availability zone and one Amazon RDS-DB instance. An administrator accidentally deleted the database, causing a day-long outage. The company wants the architecture redesigned for maximum reliability. Which solution best addresses both accidental deletion and infrastructure failures? Option A. Enable RDS multi-availability zone and deletion protection and run the web tier in an auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones behind an application load balancer. Option B. Keep one protected EC2 instance, remove the second instance, and enable RDS multi-availability zone and deletion protection. Option C. Use two independent databases and a Lambda function invoked through API Gateway to write every transaction to both databases. Option D. Use only spot instances across multiple availability zones and add CloudWatch alarms, while enabling RDS multi-availability zone and deletion protection. The correct answer is A. Enable RDS multi-availability zone and deletion protection and run the web tier in an auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones behind an application load balancer. Here's why. RDS multi-availability zone provides automatic database failover, while deletion protection reduces accidental removal risk. An ALB and multi-availability zone auto-scaling group provide redundant, replaceable web capacity. Why are the other options not correct? B. Reducing the web tier to one instance creates a single point of failure. C. Custom dual writes to independent databases introduce consistency and application complexity. D. A spot-only production web tier can lose capacity through interruptions and is less reliable. Exam tip. Protect every tier with multi-availability zone redundancy, automatic replacement, and deletion safeguards. Question number 114. A company must move an Oracle database to AWS quickly. It wants AWS to handle routine database and backup operations, but the workload depends on third-party software that requires privileged operating system and database access. Which option is the most cost-effective fit? Option A. Move to Amazon RDS for Oracle and replace every unsupported third-party feature before migration. Option B. Replatform to Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL and rewrite the application to remove Oracle-specific dependencies. Option C. Run Oracle from an Amazon EC2 AMI and manage the operating system, backups, and database software directly. Option D. Migrate to Amazon RDS Custom for Oracle and customize the environment for the required third-party components. The correct answer is D. Migrate to Amazon RDS Custom for Oracle and customize the environment for the required third-party components. Here's why. RDS Custom combines managed database operations with privileged access to the underlying environment, allowing required third-party Oracle components to be installed and supported. Why are the other options not correct? A. Standard RDS for Oracle restricts the privileged operating system access required by the workload. B. Changing database engines and rewriting the application increases cost, duration, and migration risk. C. Oracle on EC2 permits customization, but leaves substantially more database and backup administration with the company. Exam tip. Choose RDS Custom when Oracle needs managed operations plus privilege customization. Question number 115. A new cloud architect inherits many AWS accounts and regions without an accurate resource inventory. The architect must discover resources, map relationships between them, and generate current architecture diagrams with minimal manual work. Which solution is the most operationally efficient? Option A. Use AWS X-ray traces as the infrastructure inventory and manually convert traces into architecture diagrams. Option B. Deploy workload discovery on AWS to inventory resources and create relationship-based architecture diagrams. Option C. Use AWS step functions to query every account and draw the architecture diagrams manually. Option D. Use AWS Systems Manager inventory and convert its detailed reports into a relationship map. The correct answer is B. Deploy workload discovery on AWS to inventory resources and create relationship-based architecture diagrams. Here's why. Workload discovery on AWS collects resource configuration data across accounts and regions, maps relationships, and provides automatically generated architecture visualizations. Why are the other options not correct? A. X-ray traces supported application requests, but is not a complete infrastructure inventory and relationship mapper. C. Custom workflows plus manual diagram creation require development and ongoing administration. D. Systems Manager Inventory does not provide the required cross-account architecture relationship diagrams. Exam tip. Use workload discovery on AWS when current resource relationships and diagrams are required across accounts. Question number 116. A REST API uses Amazon API Gateway. Each request needs compute with 1 GB of memory and 2 GB of temporary storage. The application data must use a relational model, and the team wants the least administrative effort. Which 2 services should be added? Choose 2. Option A, Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service. Option B, Amazon EC2. Option C, AWS Lambda. Option D, Amazon DynamoDB. E, Amazon RDS. The correct answer is C, AWS Lambda E, Amazon RDS. Here's why. Lambda provides managed request-driven compute with configurable memory and ephemeral storage that meet the stated limits. Amazon RDS supplies the required managed relational database. Why are the other options not correct? A. Amazon EKS adds unnecessary Kubernetes cluster and workload administration. B. EC2 requires operating system maintenance, capacity management, and scaling administration. D. DynamoDB is a non-relational key value and document database. Exam tip. For minimum administration, pair API Gateway with Lambda and choose RDS when the data model is relational. Question number 117. An enterprise uses AWS organizations and applies a customer-created department tag to resources in every member account. Finance needs one Amazon Cost Explorer report that attributes Amazon EC2 spending to departments across the entire organization. What is the most operationally efficient approach? Option A. Activate an AWS-generated cost allocation tag, named department in each member account. Then group an EC2 report by the tag. Option B. Activate the customer-created department tag in each member account and combine separate Cost Explorer reports manually. Option C. Activate an AWS-generated department tag in the management account and group consolidated EC2 costs by that tag. Option D. In the organization's management account, activate the user-defined department cost allocation tag and create a consolidated Cost Explorer report grouped by the tag and filtered to Amazon EC2. The correct answer is D. In the organization's management account, activate the user-defined department cost allocation tag and create a consolidated Cost Explorer report grouped by the tag and filtered to Amazon EC2. Here's why. Department is a user-defined tag. Activating it from the management account makes it available for consolidated organization-wide Cost Explorer reporting and EC2 filtering. Why are the other options not correct? A. Department is not an AWS-generated tag, and member account activation does not provide the requested consolidated workflow. B. Separate reports and manual combination add unnecessary operational work. C. The tag category is incorrect because department is customer-defined. Exam tip. Activate organization-wide user-defined cost allocation tags in the management account before using them in Cost Explorer. Question number 118. A multiplayer game is hosted in one AWS region on EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group. Global players connect with both TCP and UDP, and the company wants the lowest possible network latency without changing the application protocol. Which architecture meets the requirement? Option A. Create an AWS Global Accelerator Standard Accelerator with a network load balancer endpoint that listens for the required TCP and UDP traffic and register the auto-scaling instances with the NLB. Option B. Create a CloudFront distribution with a network load balancer origin that accepts arbitrary TCP and UDP traffic. Option C. Create an AWS Global Accelerator endpoint using an application load balancer configured with TCP and UDP listeners. Option D. Create a CloudFront distribution with an application load balancer origin configured for TCP and UDP. The correct answer is A. Create an AWS Global Accelerator standard accelerator with a network load balancer endpoint that listens for the required TCP and UDP traffic and register the auto-scaling instances with the NLB. Here's why. Global Accelerator routes users through nearby edge locations onto the AWS global network. An NLB supports the required TCP and UDP listeners and distributes traffic to the EC2 fleet. Why are the other options not correct? B. CloudFront is an HTTP content delivery network and does not proxy arbitrary TCP and UDP sessions. C. An application load balancer provides Layer 7 HTTP and HTTPS handling, not general UDP listeners. D. Neither CloudFront nor an ALB satisfies the arbitrary UDP requirement. Exam tip. For globally accelerated TCP and UDP applications, combine Global Accelerator with an NLB. Question number 119. An order processing application uses an Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL single availability zone DB instance. Management wants automatic database failover with minimal downtime and no application code or endpoint changes. Which action meets the requirement? Option A. Create a red replica in another availability zone and use Route 53 weighted records for read and write traffic. Option B. Create a separate multi-availability zone deployment from a snapshot and change the application to use the new endpoint. Option C. Modify the existing RDSDB instance and enable the multi-availability zone option. Option D. Place the RDSDB instance in an EC2 auto-scaling group with 2 instances and distribute traffic through Route 53. The correct answer is C. Modify the existing RDSDB instance and enable the multi-availability zone option. Here's why. RDS can convert the existing single availability zone instance to multi-availability zone while retaining the database endpoint. The standby supports automatic failover without application changes. Why are the other options not correct? A. A red replica is asynchronous and read-only and does not provide transparent multi-availability zone failover. B. A separate restored deployment requires a migration and endpoint cutover. D. RDSDB instances cannot be members of an EC2 auto-scaling group. Exam tip. Enable RDS multi-availability zone in place when automatic failover is needed without changing the application endpoint. Question number 120. A stateless application runs on Amazon EC2 instances in one availability zone and uses an Amazon RDS multi-availability zone database. The company wants the complete application to remain available during an availability zone failure. What should a solutions architect do? Option A. Create EC2 snapshots and copy them to another AWS region for recovery. Option B. Run the EC2 tier in an auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones behind an application load balancer. Option C. Use Route 53 latency-based routing to send traffic to the existing single availability zone application. Option D. Deploy a multi-availability zone application load balancer, but keep all EC2 targets in the original availability zone. The correct answer is B. Run the EC2 tier in an auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones behind an application load balancer. Here's why. The database is already multi-availability zone. Distributing stateless EC2 capacity across availability zones with auto-scaling and an ALB removes the remaining zonal single point of failure. Why are the other options not correct? A. Snapshots support recovery, but do not provide continuously available compute capacity. C. DNS routing does not create redundant application instances in another availability zone. D. A multi-availability zone load balancer cannot maintain service if all healthy targets remain in the failed availability zone. Exam tip. A highly available stateless tier needs load-balanced auto-scaling capacity across multiple availability zones. Question number 121. A travel marketplace is exposing a product availability service to its web clients. The client interface must use REST, while the service containers run on Amazon ECS in private subnets with no direct internet exposure. API Gateway must invoke the private service. Which design meets these requirements? Option A. Create an API Gateway REST API and permit access to the ECS service only by adding a security group rule. Option B. Create an API Gateway WebSocket API and integrate it with the ECS service through a VPC link. Option C. Create an API Gateway REST API and integrate it with the private ECS service through a VPC link. Option D. Create an API Gateway WebSocket API and permit access to the ECS service only by adding a security group rule. The correct answer is C. Create an API Gateway REST API and integrate it with the private ECS service through a VPC link. Here's why. The client contract requires REST, and an API Gateway VPC link supplies private connectivity to the ECS backend without exposing the containers publicly. Why are the other options not correct? A. A security group rule alone does not create an API Gateway private integration. B. A WebSocket API does not satisfy the required REST interface. D. It uses the wrong API type and still lacks the required VPC link. Exam tip. Use an API Gateway VPC link when a REST or HTTP API must reach a private VPC backend. Question number 122. A research platform keeps customer-generated datasets in Amazon S3. Some datasets are read frequently for a period and then become cold, while others return to frequent use without warning. The company cannot forecast these access changes and wants to lower storage cost automatically. Which solution should a solutions architect recommend? Option A. Use S3 inventory reports to identify older objects and manually move them to S3 intelligent tiering. Option B. Configure an S3 lifecycle rule to transition the objects from S3 standard to S3 intelligent tiering. Option C. Configure S3 replication to copy infrequently accessed objects into S3 standard IA. Option D. Configure an S3 lifecycle rule to move all objects from S3 standard to S3 standard IA. The correct answer is B. Configure an S3 lifecycle rule to transition the objects from S3 standard to S3 intelligent tiering. Here's why. Intelligent tiering monitors access and moves objects among access tiers when usage is unpredictable or changes over time, avoiding manual classification. Why are the other options not correct? A. S3 inventory reports metadata, but does not automatically optimize objects by access pattern. C. Replication creates copies. It is not a storage class transition mechanism. D. Standard IA can add retrieval charges when objects unexpectedly become active again. Exam tip. Choose S3 intelligent tiering when access frequency cannot be predicted reliably. Question number 123. A media processing service runs in containers inside a VPC and reads and writes about 1 terabytes of objects in Amazon S3 each day. The development team wants the traffic to remain on the AWS network and wants the lowest cost private connectivity option. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A. Create an interface VPC endpoint for Amazon S3 in the VPC. Option B. Enable S3 transfer acceleration on the bucket. Option C. Enable S3 intelligent tiering on the bucket. Option D. Create a gateway VPC endpoint for Amazon S3 and associate it with the required VPC route tables. The correct answer is D. Create a gateway VPC endpoint for Amazon S3 and associate it with the required VPC route tables. Here's why. An S3 gateway endpoint keeps VPC to S3 traffic on the AWS network and has no hourly or data processing endpoint charge. Why are the other options not correct? A. An S3 interface endpoint adds hourly and data processing costs when a gateway endpoint works. B. Transfer acceleration is for accelerated internet transfers and adds cost. C. Intelligent tiering changes storage cost, not the network path to S3. Exam tip. Use gateway endpoints for low-cost private VPC access to Amazon S3 and DynamoDB. Question number 124. A multiplayer game stores player state records in Amazon DynamoDB. The application performs repeated reads of recently updated records and needs microsecond response times. The company wants to introduce caching with the fewest application changes. Which solution is most appropriate? Option A. Increase the table's provisioned read capacity and continue using the existing DynamoDB endpoint. Option B. Add an elastic cache for RedISS cluster and replace DynamoDB calls with RedISS operations. Option C. Deploy DynamoDB Accelerator, DAX, and update the application to use the DAX endpoint. Option D. Add DynamoDB Red replicas and direct reads to a replica endpoint. The correct answer is C. Deploy DynamoDB Accelerator, DAX, and update the application to use the DAX endpoint. Here's why. DAX is a DynamoDB-compatible managed cache that can deliver microsecond reads with a small client and endpoint change. Why are the other options not correct? A. More read capacity reduces throttling, but does not provide DAX-level cache latency. B. RedISS requires separate cache logic and substantially more application changes. D. DynamoDB does not expose conventional read replicas with a separate replica endpoint. Exam tip. Use DAX for DynamoDB-compatible read caching with minimal application redesign. Question number 125. An online magazine serves large volumes of images, style sheets, and JavaScript files from Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer. Traffic is rising, and the company wants to reduce requests to the origin fleet and lower delivery cost. Which solution should a solutions architect recommend? Option A. Deploy another application load balancer in a second region and direct each user to the nearest region. Option B. Associate an AWS WAF Web ACL with the load balancer and configure a rule that caches the static objects. Option C. Place an Amazon CloudFront distribution in front of the load balancer and cache the static objects at edge locations. Option D. Deploy Elastic Cache and configure the load balancer to retrieve static objects directly from the cache. The correct answer is C. Place an Amazon CloudFront distribution in front of the load balancer and cache the static objects at edge locations. Here's why. CloudFront serves cached files near users, reducing requests, processing load, and data transfer from the ALB and EC2 origin. Why are the other options not correct? A. A second regional stack adds infrastructure cost and complexity. B. AWS WAF filters requests but does not cache application content. D. Elastic Cache is not a static content origin that an ALB can query directly. Exam tip. Put CloudFront in front of web origins to offload globally requested static content. Question number 126. A container platform on Amazon ECS needs a shared Linux file system. The file system must be regional and expose a mount target in every availability zone used by the service. Backups must be copied to another AWS region by AWS Backup on a schedule that supports an 8-hour RPO. Which storage solution satisfies these requirements? Option A. Amazon FSx for OpenZFS. Option B. Amazon EFS using the standard storage class. Option C. Amazon FSx for Windows File Server in a multi-availability zone deployment. Option D. Amazon FSx for NetApp on tap in a multi-availability zone deployment. The correct answer is B. Amazon EFS using the standard storage class. Here's why. EFS standard is a regional shared file system with mount targets in multiple availability zones, and AWS Backup can copy its recovery points across regions. Why are the other options not correct? A. FSx for OpenZFS does not use the required EFS per availability zone mount target architecture. C. FSx for Windows provides SMB storage rather than the specified shared Linux NFS design. D. FSx for NetApp on tap is unnecessary for this straightforward regional EFS requirement. Exam tip. Use EFS standard for regional shared Linux storage that needs a mount target per availability zone. Question number 127. A fast-growing company creates IAM users for employees and places the users into IAM groups that correspond to their departments. New employees must automatically receive only the AWS permissions required for their department. What is the most secure way to grant the permissions? Option A. Create IAM roles with permissions boundaries and associate the roles with the IAM groups. Option B. Apply service control policies to the IAM groups to grant department permissions. Option C. Create least privilege IAM policies and attach the policies to the appropriate IAM groups. Option D. Create least privilege IAM roles and attach the roles directly to the IAM groups. The correct answer is C. Create least privilege IAM policies and attach the policies to the appropriate IAM groups. Here's why. Group attached policies let every departmental user inherit the same narrowly scoped permissions and simplify onboarding. Why are the other options not correct? A. Permissions boundaries limit maximum permissions but do not grant access to a group. B. SCPs constrain organization accounts and do not grant permissions to IAM groups. D. IAM roles cannot be attached directly to IAM groups. Exam tip. Grant department permissions by attaching least privilege policies to IAM groups. Question number 129. An engineering team manually built and validated a reference environment containing an application load balancer, an EC2 auto-scaling group, and an Amazon RDS database. The team now needs repeatable deployments of equivalent development and production environments across 2 availability zones. Which solution provides the required automation? Option A. Record the reference resources with AWS config and use the recorded configuration to provision each environment. Option B. Model the validated architecture in an AWS CloudFormation template and deploy separate stacks for each environment. Option C. Configure AWS Elastic Beanstalk to clone the complete reference infrastructure from the existing resources. Option D. Use AWS Systems Manager to copy and provision the reference stack in both availability zones. The correct answer is B. Model the validated architecture in an AWS CloudFormation template and deploy separate stacks for each environment. Here's why. CloudFormation defines the complete environment as repeatable infrastructure as code, enabling consistent automated deployments across availability zones. Why are the other options not correct? A. AWS config records and evaluates configurations, but does not provision an application stack. C. Elastic Beanstalk cannot clone arbitrary existing infrastructure as a complete reference stack. D. Systems Manager manages resources, but is not the primary full-stack infrastructure as code service. Exam tip. Use CloudFormation to reproduce validated AWS architectures consistently. Question number 130. An e-commerce application stores orders in a multi-availability zone Amazon RDS for MySQL database and uses Amazon Elastic Cache for frequently read order details. Whenever an order is created or changed, the cache must be updated as part of the write so that cache data remains aligned with the database. Which caching strategy should be used? Option A. Apply a time-to-live value to every cache entry. Option B. Use a write-through caching strategy. Option C. Use a lazy loading caching strategy. Option D. Use AWS app config caching for the order records. The correct answer is B. Use a write-through caching strategy. Here's why. Write-through updates the cache during each database write, keeping the cached order record synchronized with the authoritative database value. Why are the other options not correct? A. A TTL only expires entries. It does not update them when the database changes. C. Lazy loading fills the cache after a read miss, so new writes may not appear immediately. D. AppConfig caches application configuration, not transactional database records. Exam tip. Use write-through when cache contents must be updated with every database write. Question number 131. A payroll utility is packaged as a Windows container and runs on .NET 6. It must execute every 10 minutes, and each execution lasts between 1 and 3 minutes. The company wants a managed container solution that avoids paying for an idle task between runs. Which solution is most cost-effective? Option A. Run one standalone Windows task on Amazon ECS with AWS Fargate and use Windows Task Scheduler inside the continuously running task. Option B. Submit the container as an AWS batch job on Fargate every 10 minutes. Option C. Package the Windows container image as an AWS Lambda function and invoke it from an EventBridge schedule. Option D. Configure an Amazon ECS scheduled task on AWS Fargate to launch the Windows container every 10 minutes. The correct answer is D. Configure an Amazon ECS scheduled task on AWS Fargate to launch the Windows container every 10 minutes. Here's why. A scheduled Fargate task starts only for each short execution, supports Windows containers, and avoids managing servers or paying for an idle task. Why are the other options not correct? A. A continuously running task incurs cost between executions. B. AWS batch adds queue and compute environment features unnecessary for one simple schedule. C. Lambda does not support Windows container images. Exam tip. Use scheduled Fargate tasks for short recurring container jobs that cannot run on Lambda. Question number 132. A manufacturer is replacing independently managed AWS accounts with a centrally governed multi-account environment. It will create accounts for many divisions and must give employees access by authenticating against the company's existing corporate directory. Which combination of actions meets these requirements? Choose 2. Option A. Create an Amazon Cognito identity pool and use it as the authentication source for IAM Identity Center. Option B. Enable IAM Identity Center for the organization and connect it to the corporate directory. Option C. Configure AWS organizations to authenticate users directly against AWS Directory Service. Option D. Use a service control policy to connect IAM Identity Center to AWS Directory Service. E. Create an organization with all features enabled and create the divisional accounts in the organization. The correct answer is B. Enable IAM Identity Center for the organization and connect it to the corporate directory. E. Create an organization with all features enabled and create the divisional accounts in the organization. Here's why. AWS Organizations supplies centralized account governance, while IAM Identity Center federates the workforce directory and assigns access across those accounts. Why are the other options not correct? A. Cognito identity pools are intended for application users, not workforce access to AWS accounts. C. Organizations does not authenticate users directly through directory service. D. An SCP limits permissions. It does not integrate a directory with IAM Identity Center. Exam tip. Combine organizations and IAM Identity Center for centralized multi-account workforce access. Question number 133. A film studio must retain master footage for many years. Restores will be rare, so storage cost must be minimized, but any requested object must be retrievable within 5 minutes. Which solution is most cost-effective? Option A. Store the footage in S3 standard IA. Option B. Store the footage in S3 Glacier flexible retrieval and use standard retrievals. Option C. Store the footage in S3 Glacier flexible retrieval and use expedited retrievals. Option D. Store the footage in S3 one zone IA. The correct answer is C. Store the footage in S3 Glacier flexible retrieval and use expedited retrievals. Here's why. Glacier flexible retrieval provides low-cost archival storage, and expedited retrieval can return eligible archived objects within the required 1 to 5 minute window. Why are the other options not correct? A. Standard IA provides immediate access but costs more for rarely restored archives. B. Standard Glacier retrieval usually takes hours and misses the 5-minute maximum. D. One zone IA is not an archival class and stores data in one availability zone. Exam tip. Pair Glacier Flexible Retrieval with Expedited Retrieval when archives are rarely used but must be restored in minutes. Question number 134. A member account in AWS organizations owns a compute savings plan, but workload reductions have left more than half of the hourly commitment unused. Other accounts in the organization have eligible compute usage. The company wants those accounts to benefit from the unused commitment without moving workloads. What should the company do? Option A. Move compute workloads from another member account into the account that purchased the savings plan. Option B. List the unused savings plan commitment in the reserved instance marketplace. Option C. Enable discount sharing in the billing preferences of the member account that purchased the savings plan. Option D. Enable savings plans discount sharing from the billing preferences of the organization's management account. The correct answer is D. Enable savings plans discount sharing from the billing preferences of the organization's management account. Here's why. The management account controls organization-wide discount sharing, allowing unused savings plans commitment to apply to eligible usage in linked accounts. Why are the other options not correct? A. Workload migration is unnecessary when discounts can be shared across accounts. B. Savings plans cannot be sold through the reserved instance marketplace. C. A member account cannot enable organization-wide discount sharing. Exam tip. Manage savings plans sharing centrally from the organization's management account. Question number 135. A design firm needs to perform a one-time migration of 100 gigabytes of archived files from its data center to Amazon S3. The site has a 100 megabits per second internet connection, and all data must be encrypted in transit. Future files will be written directly to S3. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A. Order an AWS Snowball device and import the files into the S3 bucket. Option B. Deploy an AWS DataSync agent and create a one-time transfer task to S3. Option C. Run the AWS CLIS3 sync command against the S3 bucket over HTTPS. Option D. Establish an IPsec site-to-site VPN and then run the AWS CLIS3 CP command. The correct answer is C. Run the AWS CLIS3 sync command against the S3 bucket over HTTPS. Here's why. The available link can transfer 100 gigabytes in a practical period, and the CLI uses TLS for encryption without deploying an agent, appliance, or VPN. Why are the other options not correct? A. Snowball introduces ordering, shipping, and device handling for a small transfer. B. DataSync works, but requires an agent and task configuration for this one-time migration. D. A VPN adds unnecessary setup because S3 API traffic is already encrypted with HTTPS. Exam tip. For modest one-time S3 migrations, the AWS CLI over HTTPS often has the least overhead. Question number 136. A company connects its operations VPC to an on-premises data center by site-to-site VPN. Both VPN tunnels terminate on one physical customer gateway device. A separate application VPC uses two direct connect connections, and the two VPCs communicate through VPC peering. The architect must remove the remaining single point of failure. What should be added? Option A. Create a second VPC peering connection between the operations and application VPCs. Option B. Create site-to-site VPN connections directly between the two VPCs. Option C. Deploy a second customer gateway device on premises and establish another redundant set of VPN connections to the operations VPC. Option D. Attach a second virtual private gateway to the operations VPC. The correct answer is C. Deploy a second customer gateway device on premises and establish another redundant set of VPN connections to the operations VPC. Here's why. The single physical customer gateway is the remaining failure point. A second device and independent VPN tunnels remove that on-premises dependency. Why are the other options not correct? A. VPC peering is already highly available, and duplicate peering does not fix the gateway device. B. VPNs between VPCs do not protect the data center connection. D. Another virtual private gateway does not make the on-premises device redundant. Exam tip. Hybrid resilience requires redundant connectivity on both AWS and customer premises sides. Question number 137. Connected refrigeration units upload a 2 MB telemetry file to Amazon S3 at the end of each day. Each file must be summarized immediately after upload. Processing needs 1 GB of memory and completes in less than 30 seconds. The company wants the lowest cost managed solution. Which option should a solutions architect choose? Option A. Run an AWS Glue PySpark job for each uploaded object. Option B. Invoke an AWS Lambda function written in Python from the S3 object created event. Option C. Run an Apache Spark application on Amazon EMR. Option D. Run an AWS Glue Scala job for each uploaded object. The correct answer is B. Invoke an AWS Lambda function written in Python from the S3 object created event. Here's why. Lambda can process each small object immediately, supply the required memory, complete within the execution limit, and charge only for the short runtime. Why are the other options not correct? A. A Glue PySpark job has excessive startup and distributed processing overhead. C. An EMR cluster is unnecessarily costly for a 30-second, 2 MB task. D. A Glue Scala job has the same unnecessary job startup overhead. Exam tip. Use S3 triggered Lambda for short, event-driven processing of small objects. Question number 138. An enterprise uses AWS organizations with all features enabled. The security team requires billing and cost management information to be inaccessible in every member account, even to the root user of those member accounts. Which solution enforces this requirement? Option A. Attach an identity-based deny policy to all IAM principals and to the root users in the member accounts. Option B. Change the organization from all features to consolidated billing only. Option C. Attach an SCP with an explicit deny for billing actions to the organization root. Option D. Place finance users in an IAM group and attach the AWS managed billing policy. The correct answer is C. Attach an SCP with an explicit deny for billing actions to the organization root. Here's why. An SCP attached at the root constrains all member accounts and can deny billing actions to their IAM principals and root users. Why are the other options not correct? A. Identity policies cannot be attached to or directly restrict an account root user. B. Changing the organization's feature set does not enforce a billing access deny. D. The billing managed policy grants access instead of blocking it. Exam tip. SCPs can restrict member account root users, but they do not restrict the management account. Question number 139. A payment platform must process validation jobs asynchronously. Messages can be delivered more than once, strict ordering is unnecessary, and the queue must use a customer-managed AWS KMS key. The company wants the most cost-effective design. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A. Configure a Lambda event source mapping for an SQS FIFO queue encrypted with SSE-KMS and grant KMS. Decrypt to the Lambda execution role. Option B. Configure a Lambda event source mapping for an SQS standard queue encrypted with SSE-KMS and grant key invocation permission directly to the Lambda function. Option C. Configure a Lambda event source mapping for an SQS standard queue encrypted with SSE-KMS and grant KMS. Decrypt to the Lambda execution role. Option D. Configure a Lambda event source mapping for an SQS FIFO queue encrypted with SSE-SQS and grant encryption key invocation permission to the Lambda function. The correct answer is C. Configure a Lambda event source mapping for an SQS standard queue encrypted with SSE-KMS and grant KMS. Decrypt to the Lambda execution role. Here's why. A standard queue supplies cost-effective at least once delivery, and the Lambda execution role needs KMS permission to consume messages protected by the customer-managed key. Why are the other options not correct? A. FIFO ordering and deduplication are unnecessary and generally cost more. B. KMS permissions must be granted through the Lambda execution role, not to the function object. D. FIFO is unnecessary, and SSESQS does not require customer key invocation permission. Exam tip. Use SQS standard for at least once delivery when strict ordering is not required. Question number 140. A company pays for a 1 gigabits per second AWS Direct Connect dedicated connection, but sustained utilization is below 100 megabits per second. It wants to retain private connectivity while reducing the recurring port cost by right-sizing the connection. Which solution should a solutions architect recommend? Option A. Request a 200 megabits per second dedicated connection directly from the Direct Connect console. Option B. Obtain a 1 gigabits per second hosted connection from a Direct Connect partner and share it with another AWS account. Option C. Order a 200 megabits per second hosted connection through an AWS Direct Connect partner. Option D. Provision another 1 gigabits per second dedicated connection and share it with a different AWS account. The correct answer is C. Order a 200 megabits per second hosted connection through an AWS Direct Connect partner. Here's why. Hosted connections are available below 1 gigabits per second through Direct Connect partners, so 200 megabits per second preserves private connectivity while right-sizing the port. Why are the other options not correct? A. Dedicated connections are not offered at 200 megabits per second through the console. B. A 1 gigabits per second hosted connection remains oversized for the measured demand. D. Another 1 gigabits per second dedicated connection does not reduce the provision capacity or port cost. Exam tip. Use a partner-hosted Direct Connect connection when required bandwidth is below 1 gigabits per second. Question number 141. A Java data cleanup routine currently runs on an Amazon EC2 instance once per hour. Each run uses 1 gigabytes of memory, briefly needs high CPU, and finishes in about 10 seconds. The instance is otherwise idle. The company wants to minimize compute cost. Which solution best meets the requirement? Option A. Stop the EC2 instance after each execution and start it again shortly before the next run. Option B. Containerize the routine and run it as an Amazon ECS task on Fargate with 0.5 virtual CPU and 1 gigabytes of memory. Option C. Move the routine to an AWS Lambda function with 1 gigabytes of memory and invoke it hourly with Amazon Event Bridge. Option D. Containerize the routine in the existing AMI and stop only the container after each run. The correct answer is C. Move the routine to an AWS Lambda function with 1 gigabytes of memory and invoke it hourly with Amazon Event Bridge. Here's why. Lambda bills for the brief execution, allocates CPU in proportion to memory, and eliminates the cost of an EC2 instance that is idle almost all hour. Why are the other options not correct? A. Repeated EC2 startup adds delay and retains instance and EBS management overhead. B. Fargate has more startup and orchestration overhead for a 10-second hourly task. D. Stopping only the container leaves the EC2 instance running and billable. Exam tip. Use scheduled Lambda for very short periodic jobs that otherwise leave servers idle. Question number 142. A company manages several accounts in AWS organizations and assigns a different monthly cost limit to each account. When an account reaches its threshold, the company must receive a notification and automatically prevent additional resource provisioning for the remainder of the budget period. Which combination of actions meets these requirements? Choose 3. Option A. Create an IAM role that AWS budgets can assume to perform budget actions. Option B. Define each budget from the cost and usage reports section of the account. Option C. Configure a budget alert and apply an AWS config rule through a budget action to stop new resource creation. Option D. Define each budget in AWS billing and cost management for the applicable account. E. Create an IAM user with long-term credentials for AWS budgets actions. F. Configure a budget alert and a budget action that applies an appropriate SCP to the target account. The correct answer is A. Create an IAM role that AWS budgets can assume to perform budget actions. D. Define each budget in AWS billing and cost management for the applicable account. F. Configure a budget alert and a budget action that applies an appropriate SCP to the target account. Here's why. AWS budgets defines thresholds and notifications, assumes a service role for actions, and can apply an SCP that prevents additional provisioning in an organization account. Why are the other options not correct? B. Budgets are not created in the cost and usage report section. C. AWS config evaluates compliance. The preventive budget action here is an SCP. E. Budget actions should assume an IAM role rather than use long-term user credentials. Exam tip. Budget actions can assume a role and apply an SCP when an organization account reaches a cost threshold. Question number 143. A company runs a fleet of Amazon EC2 instances in one region. It needs centrally managed recovery points in a second region so that the instances can be restored there after a disaster. The company wants to avoid maintaining standby compute capacity. Which solution is most cost-effective? Option A. Schedule EBS snapshots with custom automation and periodically copy the snapshots to the second region. Option B. Create an AWS backup plan for the EC2 instances and configure automatic cross-region backup copies. Option C. Deploy an equivalent EC2 fleet in the second region and replicate files with AWS data sync. Option D. Maintain a similarly sized EC2 disaster recovery environment in the second region and continuously replicate the data. The correct answer is B. Create an AWS backup plan for the EC2 instances and configure automatic cross-region backup copies. Here's why. AWS Backup centrally schedules EC2 recovery points and copies them to another region, where the instances can be restored without maintaining standby compute. Why are the other options not correct? A. Custom snapshot scheduling and copying requires more administration. C. A duplicate fleet and data sync add unnecessary compute cost and are not managed EC2 backup. D. Keeping a full disaster recovery fleet running is more expensive than backup and restore. Exam tip. Use AWS Backup for centrally managed, scheduled cross-region EC2 recovery points. Question number 144. A logistics portal sends business documents to a manufacturing partner. The exchange must use the AS2 protocol, and the portal must authenticate its users against the company's existing identity provider. The company wants managed AWS services for both requirements. Which solution should be selected? Option A. Use Amazon AppFlow for the document exchange and an Amazon ECS task for identity provider authentication. Option B. Use AWS Transfer Family for the AS2 exchange and an AWS Lambda function to integrate the application with the identity provider. Option C. Use AWS Storage Gateway for the document exchange and an Amazon Cognito identity pool for authentication. Option D. Use AWS Data Sync for the document exchange and an AWS Lambda function for authentication. The correct answer is B. Use AWS Transfer Family for the AS2 exchange and an AWS Lambda function to integrate the application with the identity provider. Here's why. Transfer Family provides managed AS2 document exchange, while Lambda can implement the portal's authentication integration with the existing identity provider. Why are the other options not correct? A. AppFlow is for supported SaaS data flows, not AS2 partner messaging. C. Storage Gateway does not expose an AS2 transfer service. D. DataSync does not implement the AS2 protocol. Exam tip. Choose AWS Transfer Family when a managed business file exchange requires AS2. You have completed Part 4 of the SAA-C03 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.